them, and it'll be easier if I guide you, I think.
Yeah. Probably.
Okay, let's start. Okay, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
All right.
Okay, so hello.
Hello.
And your name is?
My name is Tanya Richards. I'm
And
a paper conservator.
pardon me?
I'm a paper conservator.
A paper conservator. And whereabouts are you operating from?
I am currently operating out of my home in the Comox Valley.
Okay.
I have a small studio set up in my home. I'm hoping to expand in the fall and have a larger space to work in.
And are you from here, or where are you from?
I am from Black Creek. I grew up in Black Creek. I went to Black Creek Elementary and Solem School and Courtney Junior and Vanier. So yes, I'm back home. Nice.
And so how did you get interested in this line of work or creative work?
Well, I've always been interested in art. And I have done illustration work. I do portraiture. I always been interested in history and in science, you know, how things really work. I didn't know there was such a thing as art conservation when I was choosing a career and when I was first going to university. But I was on a trip to Italy, and I saw in Poppi Castle I saw wall paintings, and they were in some state of disrepair. And I remember thinking, well, somebody must work on this. Somebody must do this.
Yeah.
And I thought that would be something that I would like to do. And I started researching and looking into it, and I found out there is art conservation and there's different areas. Found out that you could study it in Canada, in Ontario. But it was a number of years, because by this time I had a family and was busy with that. It was a number of years before I was able to go, okay, now I can go and find some training. Mm-hmm. So I went to, it was because of the way I wanted to enter the field, I wanted to get a general overview. So I did a 1-year program in Florence. Mm-hmm. I took my 2 daughters and our cats. And we lived in Florence, and I studied general conservation, a little bit of painting, easel painting, wall painting, archaeological conservation, and I did paper as an extra thing with a paper conservator in Florence, a very nice man named Maynard. And then I realized that was what I wanted to do the most. If I had to choose an area of expertise, it was going to be paper. Then I applied to Camberwell College of Art for paper conservation in London. I went there, studied for 2 years, graduated, and then I worked in Cambridge for about a year.
Wow.
So that's a long story. Sorry, probably
very impressive. Yeah, so when you were in Florence for a year.
Yes.
And so how did you know who to contact? Was it a private tutoring or as well, or?
I was searching, because I knew I wanted to do conservation, I would sort of just looking, and I was at a point in my life where I realized I could take the time for some extra education. Mm-hmm. And I could do that by getting a master's in illustration was one idea, or pursuing conservation, which was, I think, what I knew I really wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And then looking into it, I found this particular program through Studio Art College International in Florence. That there's only about 8 people that go into it, and it was great. It was fantastic. Really
perfect for you, yeah. And you had your little daughters with you.
Yes, I did, and they, I think, had a pretty interesting time too. My youngest went to school in Italy, so yeah.
That's an education in itself for them.
Yes. I hope they appreciate it. I hope they'll think so.
Oh, well, it's ingrained into them now. Right? Yeah. So when you first went over to Italy, you were on vacation?
No, I went intending to go. Oh, when I first went.
First time.
Yes, I was on vacation.
And so did you, oh, sorry, did you, you said you went to a castle.
Yes.
And you looked at the frescoes art?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so that's like a plaster technique.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe what that technique, that's obviously a very old building that you were in,
Yes.
right? So can you describe what that technique is and how you would restore it? Did you learn anything about that process?
Yes, I did. The fresco that I was initially talking about was in Poppi Castle in Tuscany.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was in Florence, we worked in the Pergolo Theater on frescoes that had been done in the 19th century.
Okay.
So a fresco technique is that you are painting with, so I won't discuss the calcium hydroxide, but they're plastering with a layer of wet calcium hydroxide on the wall, and then you're preparing pigments that would be organic pigments, and you paint directly into the wet plaster. So when the plaster solidifies, the pigment actually becomes a part of it, and it's very permanent, and it tends to hold up extremely well over time. There's two different techniques. There's the painting on the wet plaster, or there's mixing a little bit of the calcium hydroxide with the pigment and painting that. And that's what they did in the 19th century, and that was what we were restoring. Mm-hmm. We used poultices to clean the walls, because there was a lot of graffiti on the walls. So we'd be using ammonia poultices, and we'd have to use mass. It would be like a pulp paper mixture that we would mix with the ammonia. It would be set, it would dry, and it would help pull out the dirt and the grime. We photographed the walls because there was a lot of graffiti from the Second World War. Soldiers had been occupying those apartments that had been actors' apartments. So we photographed all that to preserve it, and then removed the graffiti and did some retouching and cleaning of the walls.
Yeah, it sounds very in-depth, intricate.
It was. I have to say it because I'm a little bit nervous on camera. I'm thinking I should be describing the process of how calcium hydroxide becomes calcium carbonate, which is
that's fine. No, there's no need.
Suddenly my science brain goes numb.
Right, that's fine. I just general overview is fine. There's not a lot of call for that type of restoration in Canada, I would think.
No, there's not even that many people who do it in the world.
No. It's an old lost art, more or less. So that you did some on-site training with that, and then how were you doing the paper restoration in Europe? Were you trained in that particular method there?
I worked at a paper conservation studio in Florence for a paper conservator. I did some work. It was kind of a side program. It was part of the schooling, but I chose it almost like an elective. And then an internship there afterwards. I worked on some really interesting things. I worked on some.
What kind of things did you?
I worked on an 18th century map. That was the first thing I remember he gave me, and I would be doing infills with Japanese paper, and then retouching the losses. I helped him line that. That was a huge, huge map. Then I got to work on an illuminated parchment for one of the churches there. And there was also some losses, some infilling losses with, again, using Japanese paper, some retouching and repairs. We did a lot of work on documents damaged in the Florence flood.
water
yeah,
water damage.
That's something that's ongoing there. So there was lots of boxes of that, which was really great for learning to do tear repairs on really thin old papers.
Mm.
So yeah. So
So you do tear repairs? Do you use a chemical? What's your process, if you don't mind me asking?
For tear repairs, well, everyone is a little bit different. That's what makes paper conservation so fascinating, because there's so many differences in the kinds of paper that you'd use over the years on parchment. We use Japanese paper most of the time, and we often use wheat starch paste, methyl cellulose, mixture of the two, depending on how the media can take moisture. There are things we can use other than that if we can't use moisture, but mostly your first thing would be wheat starch paste.
Kind of a gluing process of glue, and then make an invisible sort of melt. Oh, that's
you would
very...
well, there's some tears you would take a thin strip and then you will paste it out, and the thickness of the Japanese paper you use depends on the paper. Sometimes you can take little bits of fine paper pulp and turn it into a paste and fill in.
Right.
Infill. Sometimes you're taking infills that you trace using various methods and maybe chamfer the edges down and put them in using wheat starch paste. And again, sometimes we use different cellulose ethers with it, perhaps. Sometimes there's different things that we would use because something might not take the wheat starch paste appropriately, like you might not want to use much moisture. There's a lot of different things that we use depending on the media, depending on the tear, depending on what needs to be done.
So you're familiar with several different kinds of paper. So the ancient papers that you would work on would be vellum. Is that right? Vellum? Is that one?
That's one in the parchment. I do that. I mean, most work I have worked on parchment or vellum. Vellum is kind of one type of parchment.
Oh, it is. Okay.
But and yeah, there's, again, it's part of what we do. Probably I will work more, especially in Canada, more on paper. But I have done work on
like paper, wood-based paper from wood.
Well, hopefully not, but most 20th century paper is wood-based. Most paper prior to, throughout history, most paper is rag-based.
Right.
And then when they started running out of rags, they started trying to come up with ways to create more. When they needed to make more paper, that was when they started using wood pulp. Then it became, finding ways to take the acidity out and different stuff. But paper, prior to the 19th century was generally all rag-based, and that paper is very strong.
So by rag-based, you mean cotton or
linen? It would be mostly, there's other things. They would use old rope. Sometimes they use cotton, but in Europe, they mostly used linen. That's where your rag pickers came from.
Right.
You get old linen clothing, and it would be beaten to a pulp, pulverized. They would pick it to choose, like if they wanted really white paper versus wrapping paper would have been, browns and blues, and that would have been because they were mixing coarser fabrics in things that were dyed, things that were, you have jute and hemp, different things would be thrown in because it wasn't as important. So the finer linens that were whiter would be in the pile for what would be the best paper. So then there were these machines that would beat it to a pulp, and then of course it's turned into in water. There's like a big vat, and you have a frame, and you dip it into the frame, and there's a decal edge, and then it would be flipped and turned onto a pile, and there would be felts in between, and then a stack of them would be pressed, so all the water would come out, and then it would be hung to dry. It's done a little bit differently over the years in different periods. Different things changed. There's a whole study of the history of paper making. It's very interesting. And different fiber, like there are experts who can tell you authenticity based on the paper, just
Yes.
the
Yeah.
paper. But anyway, so mostly you're looking at linen. Nowadays we use cotton. Cotton was used later on, but linen was what was used throughout in Europe most of the time, up until the 19th century when they started industrialization. They started having to find ways to expand paper production. So lots of different things started being used.
Tough. Linen is very tough fibers.
Linen holds up really well. So older paper tends to be in good shape. It's newer paper that you have more, 20th century papers that get really brittle, that there's a lot of acidity and things like that. Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, I think I'm talking too much here. But
No, you're not. I'm asking questions. It's interesting. So, in the background behind you, looks like you have your workspace there. And if you wouldn't mind just walking over there and just picking up a couple of things and showing us what your tools are that you use.
Okay. Well, I'll just tell you what this actually is. This doesn't look. What this is a 1920s poster. It was on a highly acidic backing that I removed. And you can see the paste marks here that are brown. And the brown,
Right.
from the brown, I think it's gelatin that they use to paste it on. But it's brown because of the acidity of the board. And it's become very brittle. Pieces are missing. And this is because it was sitting on an acidic backboard for so long. So I used, you can use different things to get the backing off. It's actually can be quite a tedious and difficult process because the last thing you want to do is go through into the artwork. And in this case, it was really difficult because this thing is in so many different pieces. So I'm going to use methyl cellulose here to moisten some of these areas to get off a little bit more of the paper. And then I'll probably use that also to get off this, the old paste and clean it up before I do. And then I'm going to test the front to make sure the inks are stable. And then I'll wash it. Then I'll line it and fill in the infills. And from photos on the internet that tell me what this used to look like, I will be able to retouch the losses. I've already found this poster online, so I know I can do that. We use, these are just lots of different soft brushes. I use a bone folder. I use different tools to get the backing off. Yeah, there's a lot. I will be using more other things. I'm trying to think. This is a weight. We use different weights. I have over here a suction table. I don't know if you can see that, which I use. Might be difficult to see. When I'm trying to wash something that you don't want to, it pulls the moisture right through, which is hooked up over here.
Oh, I can't see it.
Very easy to see it. It's not that interesting, but that's what it does. It's a suction table. It's got paper.
Okay.
But the idea being, say you're washing something that you can't immerse in water, you can put water and isopropyl or whatever you need to do and it immediately pulls it right through the paper so that it doesn't horizontally move or do any damage. Say if there's a spot you're trying to get out in a particular area, but you don't want to get moisture on another area. So we use
the isopropyl. What's the isopropyl used for again?
Well, we often use mixtures. We use water and isopropyl or isopropyl just for general cleaning, removing.
Cleaning, yeah, it works very well.
Yeah, we use
so
that.
How long,
yeah.
Excuse me. How long would it take for you to say restore that map in the background there? First of all, how long to clean it and take the old glue off?
It took me. Actually, the back didn't come off that badly. I think it probably took me about 4 hours to get that back off. Sometimes it's a lot harder than that. It will take me, I would say in total, this is about a 20-hour job. It's a fairly big job.
That's a big job.
Yeah.
And then you said something about putting a backing on the piece. So is that a thin layer of some other kind of paper that you can add more imagery to when you flip it over, or?
Well, because it's in so many pieces, sometimes I would, you know, if you can, you want to just repair the tears, but sometimes you might line the entire piece with a thin sheet of Japanese paper to hold it together. And then you would put infills on top of that. If I was, when I worked in the United Kingdom, most of the places I worked had stores of 20th century papers, and you'd try to match a paper that had been used so that you're using as close to the same paper as possible. When I was in Italy, they often just used layers of Japanese paper.
Mm-hmm.
I have had to do a few infills since I've been here, and I have used Japanese paper because I don't have historic stores of paper. I've worked in the British Museum and in other places. They have stores of paper. I don't.
Not you though. Okay, so I would like to ask you too, when you do your work,
Mm-hmm.
there's a big piece missing, a whole section of the image is missing. Do you just do that, like fill it in by like yourself with paint, or how do you restore images that are missing?
So this is an example. This is a piece of polyester millinex.
Okay.
So what I did, this is from a photograph that there was a piece missing. I trace using this. I trace the edge as closely as possible to the missing piece. Difficult to see, but I think you get the idea.
It's clear, like a clear plastic.
Yeah, and then actually I have this here. I had toned Japanese paper this color because that was the general color, the closest to the loss.
Right.
And I toned that ahead of time. And then I put this on here, and then I use a, there's different ways you could do it, but I use a sharp. Something that we use here in bookbinding. And I would trace the edge of the paper on here, and then I'd use a brush with a little bit of water and then tear. So I have a bit of a feathered edge. Then I might chamfer with a scalpel down to get it nicely so that it has a nice angle to it.
Yes, I understand.
I would use wheat starch paste, very small brush, and carefully and finally place the finished piece into the loss. And in this particular instance, you can see here what I've done is I used a thinner Japanese paper as well for support, so that on the photograph it was kind of sandwiched. You got the thin Japanese paper on the back, and then this was on the front. I don't know if that's easy to see. I can show a before and after photo of this piece as an example that I could add on to this interview, if that would help understand what I mean, and they could see where I've filled the loss in, because I have that. So yes, then I carefully would go over after I filled it in. Now, in this particular photograph, it had been in a flood, so there was a lot of discoloration. You're not going to be able to, match one color. So I just carefully tried to use like a little bit of watercolor, pastel pencil to kind of retouch it, to blend it as the best, to get the best blend I can with the piece that I've put in. What you often do with infills, sometimes you would just put an infill in. You're never trying to make it appear like it's not there. You're just trying to make it aesthetically so that it can maintain aesthetic integrity. So if you know exactly what was there, like letters, and I can find it, I'll put them back in. I mean, anybody looking closely is going to see that I've done that. But it's something, again, that is whole, that you can look at, and the message is retained. Right. What I didn't do with this photograph is I didn't, it had been in a flood, and there's streaks across the photo. It's possible, probably, to to have covered that up. But I wouldn't do that, because you want to see what's happened to the photograph. You want to maintain the history and the age. The photograph was very badly torn, and it was a huge loss. And if it was not in the image area, but on the side. So if you left it untreated, it's likely to split in half or to split in pieces, or somebody in years to come is going to go, oh, this is garbage. So if you fix it so that it's whole and it can be handled, that's a good thing. But I didn't want to cover up the history of it, or that it's old. You don't want to try to make it look new. There's kind of a balance there. Repair it so it can be handled, but not so that...
it's a restoration, not a
restoration.
So another thing is, who would you say your most interesting client has been? The most interesting client, or the most interesting piece of work, maybe?
I think when I was working in Cambridge, I was able to do a large piece that was from one of the colleges that was a silhouette, and it was a silhouette from the late 19th century, and it was tricky. It was very tricky. There was a lot of work to be done because papers at that time were very acidic, and I had to rehouse it. And so that was probably the most interesting piece I've worked on. Another interesting one was I had to do a tricky rehousing of an Alfred Wallace pastel. I don't know if you know who Alfred Wallace was. He was a St. Ives artist. But those were probably the two things that I can think of that challenged me the most. Yeah.
Well, pastels are, I would think that'd be almost impossible, because it's so, just you put a stroke down and that's it. And I don't know how you even make that look natural if you had to do an infill.
No, there was no infill. It was just mostly, somebody else, it had been, I didn't even have to do the consolidation. That one was just a tricky rehousing, which sometimes that's the conservation you're doing where, it's in an old frame, you want to maintain the old frame, but the old frame isn't necessarily healthy for the object because it's up against the glass, or it has a bad backing, an acidic backing. So reusing old framing, and that one I had to build up the back so that we can move it away from the glass. And that was that was what was challenging about that piece. So a lot of conservation isn't just about changing, isn't even just necessarily restoration. Sometimes it's prevention by making sure that the objects are in an environment that they're going to be able to be maintained.
Well, yeah, sometimes people have, I myself have a photograph. I have a photograph and a pastel that are pressed against glass in a frame, and I'm afraid to take them out. I don't even want to touch them because they'll be damaged if I remove them from the frame.
Sometimes.
So is that, is that from moisture, or why does that even happen?
It's often a bit of moisture, but I mean, often I had to remove pastels. This was another interesting job. Strawberry Hill House in the United Kingdom. They were rehousing a collection of 18th century pastels and watercolors for a show they did last year. And I had some pastels that were right up against the glass, and they didn't know how long they'd been there. And so I opened it up, and then I got a wonderful surprise, because it turns out that on the back, when the backing was removed, the artist had incomplete drawings. And
oh, wow.
That was exciting. They weren't stuck to the glass. So I was afraid though, and I did call a lot of people for advice. And if I had had any resistance, I would have had to look into, what to do. Because yes, it is, especially with pastels, it's very, very difficult, very friable. They did come off very easily. They weren't stuck to the glass, so I didn't have any problems.
That's good.
Probably would have been able to do it with a light humidification in a humidification chamber or something like that. Every single situation is very different, and I've learned that different conservators will have different solutions. I mean, it's what's interesting about it is that you know, I've seen very experienced people all sit around and come up with a different idea of how they think it should be done, and talking about it and coming up with what seems to be the safest way is it's one of the more satisfying things about doing this. And one of the things I miss about working by myself right now. But I do have people for advice, yeah.
Well, we live in a very high humidity climate here. And so there's a lot of things that get mold, moisture, things stick together. How do you deal with mold? I don't know. I'm just curious. It's not even.
Well,
Is there a way to fix that or no?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's lots of different kinds of mold, and there's different kinds of staining. Mold can do all kinds of different things that will require different kinds of repairs. I've seen mold turn really good linen paper to dust.
Yes. You must have seen a lot of different. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. It just depends. Dealing with mold. If you have mold in, say, I was given some books when I was working, and they had to be taken. They had some mold in them. They were very valuable, though. So we took them to like we have a fume cupboard, and the fume cupboard takes the mold spores, which can be quite toxic. And removes them while I'm working. So you can working in the fume cupboard, and then I was using a mixture of isopropanol and water as a spray to spray on the mold, which evaporates very quickly and doesn't do damage to the book. So that's something that is one of the things you can do. But things can go wrong really quickly. And one of the reasons that when I've now moving into doing paper conservation on my own, I've been trying to figure out, you know, how you talk about what you do, because one of the things people worry about is that people try and do things by themselves because it looks like it's easy, you know, separating photographs or doing something. And sometimes it does work and sometimes it doesn't, and you have to know when it's not working and what you're going to do, you know, if you have a disaster, or how you're going to fix it. So I know that's just this general, sometimes conservators, and I want to be able to put things out there, you know, show what you do, but I know that conservators have a reputation for seeming to not share, and that's where a little bit of that comes from, is this idea. I saw that happen once where somebody was showing somebody how to fix, and they said, oh, that looks, I said, well, no, it actually isn't easy. It might look easy, but it's not easy, and you can rip these really easily if you try to do it and you don't have a feel for when you're going to wreck it. So when I say spray, that's what I say. When I say spray with, I'm talking about using something that has a very fine mist. You know, you're using a fume cupboard, you're watching the evaporation level, you're making sure that you're not getting any staining. There's a lot of things you're considering as you're doing it. But that's one of there's different ways of dealing with mold. There's ways of getting mold staining out. Yes, mold has lots of different issues.
Well, it's interesting
helps.
that you like, if you share your knowledge, I think it's a healthy thing to do, because people are like, oh, I can do that myself, and they go to give it a try and they can't. So then they call you anyway because you've been generous.
Yeah, but it's not about, it's just, did they wreck something? That's what you don't want.
Well, they might, but that's on them. Not you, right?
That's what you don't. It's not about the work, because there's not lots of, you know.
Not everybody's cut out to do the kind of work you do. It's it not only is it time consuming, but it's very, very detail oriented, and to the point that most people, well, many people won't bother with that. They just can't do it, and so it's a niche. And I hope you're successful here. You know, I didn't know you existed. Now I do. If I have something I need to restore.
Well, I haven't been here very long. I haven't been back. I came back in the fall, but it's you know, taken me a bit to get equipment. I don't have a fume cupboard, but I do have a fume trunk, which should be here this week.
Excellent.
I'm steadily increasing the equipment I have and things that I can do. So, yeah.
That's great. That's great that you're here. think there's a real need for it. There is no one, I don't think, doing that. And
there's some paper conservators in Victoria. Know that, yeah. But
we don't always go down to Victoria.
No.
No. People tend to stay around here. Well, that's great. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add. You've talked about your process. You talked about your experience leading up to the decision, or the decision to do this kind of work. You talked a little bit about, you didn't talk about your clients. What type of clients approach you? Are they just regular people, or museums, or galleries, or what?
Well, before coming back to Canada, I frequently, I worked, either did internships with institutions, or when I was working in Cambridge, we did work for quite a few institutions, and we would do the work to set up the repair work for a show. But then we also did work for private clients. Coming back to Canada, I've so far had only private clients that have had some referrals through a few local galleries, a few people that knew I was here. I haven't been up and running for all that long. Mm-hmm. I've approached, some museums to say I'm here. So I hope to have a mixture of work with museums and private clients. I like doing surveys as well as doing the work, where you do a survey and do recommendations for storage and housing, things like that.
Perfect. Yeah, that'll be great. Well, good luck with everything, and thank you so much. I think our time is up. I can't think of any more